Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Hello, and welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth, broadcasting weekly on KUNX Digital Broadcasting. Our guest tonight is a return guest and somebody whose work I am a huge fan of. ABC News has called Marc Hartzman one of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre. And George Noory from Coast to Coast AM has said, as bizarre as Robert Ripley. Hartzman considers both high praise since his passion for the unusual started with Ripley's Believe It or Not and the annual Guinness World Records book during his youth. In addition to his books about UFOs, ghosts, Mars, Oliver Cromwell's embalmed head, weird things on eBay, sideshow performers, and unorthodox messages from God, Hartzman has written for Mental Floss, HuffPost, AOL Weird News, All That's Interesting, the Morbid Anatomy Online Journal, and Bizarre Magazine. He discusses oddities on CNN, MSNBC, Ripley's Radio, History Channel's The UnXplained, Xploration Outer Space, the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum, and dozens of podcasts. Hartzman has also been a featured speaker at events that range from audiences including the Explore Mars Humans to Mars Summit in Washington, D.C., the Coney Island Congress of Curious Peoples, New York's ComicCon, the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO Festival and Conference, and the Brooklyn Historical Society. More of his love for the unusual can be found online at Weird Historian. Outside of these projects, Hartzman earns a living as an award-winning advertising creative director. And on this show, he will be speaking about his newest book, To the Hilt, A Sword Swallower's History of Sword Swallowing, among other things. Marc Hartzman, welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth, my friend.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be back. Appreciate you having me.
I want to ask several questions at the same time, but the human mind and voice is not calculated to do that. So let me start with the first question. You say that your interest in the odd and the unexplained and the unusual begins with your interest in Robert Ripley. I think even people not that familiar with him, certainly familiar with Ripley's Believe It or Not, and the wonderful Guinness World Book of Records. Before you made this hard turn into the unusual, can you tell us a little bit about who you were before that? Where were you born, Mark? And can you tell us a bit about your childhood and family?
There wasn't much before that.
You were just born a very weird baby.
I was born a weird baby. I was born in Denver, Colorado. And grew up there, and I got into Ripley's and Guinness kind of early on. I remember watching Ripley's Believe It or Not in the kitchen. We had like one of those small TVs. I think we actually had a black and white TV in the kitchen, color TV downstairs, black and white small set. And I think that was when I'm forgetting the host right now. Jack Palance was hosting, like back in the mid 80s. Sure. The 80s, whenever that was. And I love that. And I love, anything with Ripley's, just the oddities just really got my imagination. But combined with that was the Guinness Book of Records. And it was those, at the time, they were those sort of thick brick-sized books, all black and white. And I remember getting them the early years in the 80s. And I was just so fascinated by the first section of the book. I didn't really care about most anything past like the first 50 pages. It was that first chapter was always the human body. And that's what really intrigued me. Again, it's like you had the world's tallest man, Robert Wadlow, who was 8 feet, 11 and a half inches tall. That like boggles the mind that a human being could get that tall. Then you have the guy with like the curly fingernails that reached down to his feet and curled, and like, how does that happen? Right. The world's heaviest twins and the world's smallest person and all these different things. Just, I loved it. And then combined with all that, I loved watching, I saw The Elephant Man when I was maybe too young, and that really imprinted on my brain. And Time Bandits I loved, still my favorite movie, with the band of little people traveling through time and all this wonder and imagination. So all these things kind of just really settled in my head, and I've loved it all ever since.
Had you any thought that, as an adolescent or a teenager, that this would be a preoccupation that would become professional? I mean, aside from your career as an advertising executive, or could you have imagined that?
Not entirely. I would say that when I was a kid, I would make my own magazines a lot. So I loved Mad Magazine, and I would sometimes also buy Cracked Magazine, which was like the Mad Magazine, ripoff basically. It was another magazine. And so I would make my own, which I called Smashed. And I would just write these cartoons and comics and goofy things, all completely inspired by those two magazines, and I always like had this vision, like, oh, someday I want like my thing on like a newsstand or on a bookshelf somewhere. And I made other little things like that as well. So I always wanted to create things and see it out in the world. When the Apple II Plus was like a new computer, again, this is going back to the mid 80s, and we got one. And the first desktop publishing program that was ever made was called the Newsroom. I think that's what it was called. Yeah, Newsroom. And so it came with like clip art, like these goofy little.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
And I would find these images and I would write stories to them. And I made a newspaper that I would sell at school, just writing goofy stories. And so I looked back at these years later when I was in college, and like these stories were so kind of twisted and funny. Like there's like, I was a weird little kid. So, so that kind of actually reignited my joy of that. And I started publishing a zine, which is called Backwash. And that was just all things I was into. Whatever I was into, I would write about. I was, reviewing bands and getting music in the mail. And it was actually quite a lot of fun as I entered my 20s to, be connected with all these different music labels and publicity companies, getting +1s to concerts and all this crazy stuff because I write something about their album, But then I got more and more into the world of sideshow, which was partly just because I was into it. And I'd seen the movie Freaks, that was from 1932 by Todd Browning, which is an amazing film, and everyone should see that if they haven't. And then I met the thing that kind of was like a big sort of turning point, I'd say, for me was, and this will segue into the new book project actually. I met there was a place in New York City called the Freakatorium, which was a little sideshow museum on the Lower East Side, on Clinton Street, and I read about in some magazine or newspaper or something. So I went down there and I met the guy who ran it. It was a tiny little museum, but it was packed, just and beautifully curated, beautiful cabinets, and everything was beautifully labeled, and ornate frames of all these amazing old cabinet cards of sideshow performers, Bearded Lady, Conjoined Twins, you name it. Ripley's posters, vintage on the ceiling, like just everything everywhere. Your eyes were just like, you could not see something amazing wherever you looked. And so I started talking to this guy. His name was Johnny Fox, and he was a sword swallower. And he'd been performing since the 70s. And he spent decades performing at the Maryland Renaissance Festival, and performances all around, talk shows and things like this. And during all those years, he was collecting. So he finally opened his museum to share his collection. And I was so amazed by all these things. I didn't know you could buy things like that. Wow. I didn't know that there were these cabinet cards of sideshow performers from the 1800s. I didn't know these things were out there. So I got to know him, and it actually led to my first book, Found on eBay, because I started buying these things on eBay because that's what led to my realization you could buy weird things there. But he was really good about encouraging me to write and like make my magazine bigger and just push these things. And by writing about him for Backwash and then for Bizarre Magazine, and then I met other sideshow people, kind of started networking with these different members of that community, you just like, the UFO community, meet you, and then you introduce me to someone, same kind of thing, right? You just meet everyone who's connected, and they all could see my passion for this, and that really helped me be accepted by them to write about them, because I would write very positive things because I love what they're doing. And I would tell them, like, thank you for what you do because you give me something to write about, and I want other people to know what you do because I love it. They should love it too. It's always kind of how I approach these things. And so I wrote more and more of that for Backwash, and eventually that turned into my second book called American Sideshow.
As you're talking, I'm realizing there's so many parallels in our childhoods in terms of, for me, Ripley's Believe It or Not was a cartoon in the newspaper every week by a very particular artist that, if you're a Ripley's fan, it's a style that you only associate with him. And it would be just a few lines of text and a simple drawing about something jaw-droppingly unusual. And all of the other subjects, and a devotee of Mad Magazine as well. I'm surprised that I never heard of the Freakatorium as then sort of a lifelong New York City resident. I regret never having visited there myself. And I want to kind of hold off on the sword swallowing itself till a bit later in the show, because that is going to be our focus. Of course, we met because you had written a book that you sent me a copy of, The Big Book of Mars. And I tore through that book like in 2 days. First, the content was fascinating. And as somebody with a background in the arts and design, it was such a beautifully laid out and well thought out book with really great production values. And you told me that you were working on a book about UFOs. How did you first become interested in UFOs?
So
was that a specific event or thing, or just one more interesting thing that you heard about?
No, I would say in a way it was partially connected to the Big Book of Mars, but that goes back to, again, in my childhood of liking weird stuff. Like UFOs kind of fell into that category. I bought those like Mysteries of the Unknown books, from Time Life. Like my mom would order those for me. They're actually on the shelf over here. Still have
I've
them all,
got the set is amazing.
Yeah.
I have to jump in and say, when it first came out in the 80s, my first thought was Time Life. This is going to be just a silly, superficial thing. They were good. In fact, in that series, there's not just a book on UFOs, but one on UFO abductions, which I made my way into, as well as Bud Hopkins, who I worked for such a long time. And I was incredibly impressed by them, and still am, and they're on my shelf as well.
Yeah, they're beautiful books. So that was like another thing that was like put into my head at a very early age. So I was always fascinated by that. But yes, I kind of went into the sideshow direction, as I already discussed, right? For like sort of started kind of kicking off my writing career, in terms of books and everything. And then sideshow to me is just branched out into all these other sort of oddities. Like to me, it all sort of stems from that root, But when I wrote the Big Book of Mars, that book started with me stumbling upon this weird story from the 1920s about a guy in London who was telepathically communicating with a Martian woman. That's not UFOs, but it's related space, right? And this idea of extraterrestrial life. And that was such a weird thing to read about. I'm like, what is going on here? And the more I dug into that story and learned about it, and their attempts to send telegrams to Mars while I was in opposition in 1926 and 1928, I started uncovering all the things happening in the periphery. Coney believing that he was receiving Martian signals in 1920.
Right.
Director of astronomy at Harvard looking for ways to send messages to Mars through, a giant field of mirrors by reflecting light, sending light signals. Tesla's belief in he was also contacted by Mars, and his firm belief until his dying day that we would make contact with extraterrestrials. So all these stories were just amazing to me. And that's kind of how the Big Book of Mars started. And as I continued writing that book and getting into the late 1940s and early 50s, that's where that book has a section on UFOs.
Yeah.
And the connection there being that there were some members of the military who believed that UFOs, that the source might be Mars. So that's how it works its way. And so within that, I also kind of gave a sort of a brief background, a little bit of like the Kenneth Arnold story, but not diving too deep into it, because it wasn't necessary for that particular chapter. But getting into like why that might be from Mars, and the atomic age happening, and we're concerning our neighbors, planetary neighbors, and these things. And I like that a lot. Like, this was fascinating to me, kind of dipping my foot in a little bit. But I didn't, again, there's a small section in a book, a big book. So after that, after the Big Book of Mars, I wrote Chasing Ghosts, which is about the paranormal and rather different.
Yeah.
Although there's some overlap with Martians there too, from the late 1800s and mediums going to Mars. But then I was looking for another book, and I thought, UFOs I would love to kind of dive back into that. It's a fascinating topic. I'd known Lee Spiegel for years. Through AOL Weird News. We both wrote for AOL Weird News for our friend Buck Wolf. And so I'd met him, and he was the UFO guy and I was the sideshow guy, which was fun.
Lee was one of our favorite people. Our producer, Ray Hobbs, and myself. I first met him in the late 80s, although we kind of brushed by each other at the United Nations 10 years earlier, when he was responsible for putting together that event, sponsored by the Prime Minister of Grenada. Had you ever had any sightings or UFO events, or anybody that you knew that just made it, one step more credible or personal?
For me, the person I knew that had the most unusual experiences, well, one was Lee. His story in North Carolina and Lumberton was, it's a great story, and it's one of those ones where, like, for me, it was always one of these things, like, you can read all these stories and then you can wonder, but when you get to know the person and you hear that, and same with you, Peter, like meeting you and hearing your stories, when you know that person and this person isn't making things up, they're not looking for money, there's not like some ulterior motive, that makes a big difference. It's like, I know this guy and he's telling me this story, and I know Lee researched, I saw his own research papers from the 70s. David Marler has them. So I was going through that at Dave's place, but he did his homework. It's like, what could this be? And there was no logical answer. Checking with the Air Force, the local Air Force, all these different avenues he went down, and there was nothing, and it remains unknown. So it makes it a really intriguing case. I personally haven't seen something that I feel like, I saw UFO. But so many people have, and you wonder, like, something must be going on. This many people are seeing something or experiencing something. Not everybody's making up these stories, especially through time, so it remains a fascinating topic to me.
One of the things I love about your book is it's a book that can be enjoyed by somebody with my level of interest and experience and reading, or a complete newbie. It could be a first introduction. But you are not only drawn to the accounts, but also to the wonderful way that it's been expressed visually over the decades. There is something about the golden age of UFOs art that I find incredibly appealing. It's really in a class by itself, and there's a whole category of book covers that are just wonderful. Some of them. There you go.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You have a work methodology. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And, sorry, I'm totally going
again. There. No, that's fine. And again, it's such a beautifully laid out book. It's one that you can share with friends, whatever their attitude, they will be interested. Yes, and we are not. How can I say? You have a work methodology, a you become interested in something enough to become involved in it, to start writing. You work it through, you complete the project, and then my sense is it's a part of you that kind of sticks your head up and goes, so what's next? And
Yes.
I wanted to know how you made the transition from not being a writer, working in the world of advertising and, supporting your family, to coming up with the idea for the first book, putting it together. And of all things, talk about the strange and the unusual, things that people sell and buy or have sold or have offered for sale on eBay. It's funny, it's insane, it's fascinating, and in a few cases troubling.
Yeah, for sure.
How did you get that idea, for starters?
So first of all, I'll just back up a little bit. So I mentioned I was doing a zine called Backwash, and I started that when I was a senior in college. And so I continued doing that once I started my ad career. I was like literally staying late at the office to make Xeroxes by hand, and stapling them. And then eventually I got picked up by Tower Records. For those who remember Tower Records, old enough to remember that, when you could actually go to a store to buy music, which was fun. And so they gave me this distribution across all Tower Records internationally, which was crazy. So then a guy at my office, because we did advertising, there was a lot of print production going on. So he would kind of lump my zine into some print production jobs so I could get it professionally printed and stapled and trimmed, which is amazing. Yeah. So my sort of handmade thing started to get some nice polish to it, which was great. I'm thankful to him to this day. So I was working really hard on this. This was a real labor of love. I was barely making anything on this thing. And I thought, you know what? I've always wanted to do a book, and I tried a few ideas that didn't go anywhere. And I thought I need to just take all this energy and passion I'm putting into the zine, and maybe I can make some money if I put it into a book idea, put the same energy, just transfer it, So I did that. And that idea, I briefly mentioned, kind of was sparked by meeting Johnny Fox at the Freakatorium and realizing I started buying a few cabinet cards of sideshow performers on eBay. And I thought this was kind of odd. Like, I was buying these photos of, in one case, a man who, his name is Eli Bowen. He had no legs. He just had feet, and he had a family and children. And he was called the Legless Acrobat, or the Legless Wonder. There's another one I bought of a little person named Admiral Dots, little man in miniature, dressed impeccably, standing on a chair, and beautiful photo. And I thought, is this kind of odd that I'm finding these photos and these people on eBay? I mean, to me it wasn't, because I love it, right? But I thought there's probably things that are objectively weird to anyone, like that everyone would agree, like, yeah, that's weird. So I started just thinking of weird keywords and typing them in, and I started finding a lot, and so then I would write the sellers really weird questions, and I'd see what they would respond. So as an example, it was always one of my favorites, and one of the few that I included in my pitch to the first editor that ended up buying it, who thankfully was laughing in his cubicle and was like, I gotta get you a book deal here. So this woman was selling something called, it was paperweights made from deer poop. So she called them pooperweights, and she would put these deer droppings in a little crystal paperweight, and then put like little fake leaves and little fake snowflakes in it, and make it look pretty. And I thought Pooperweights is a hilarious name. And so I wrote her and told her I was collecting, different droppings from different animals across America. And I was wondering where these came from, and if it was something that would, help complete my collection. And she wrote back and told me where she found them. And she offered moose droppings and turkey droppings from different states. And it was, it was very funny. And so then my wife would take photos. My girlfriend at the time, she'd take the photos for me, Liz. And it just was a beautiful book of all these amazing images, and the number of bids, the selling prices, all the little stats that eBay gives you, and then our letters, our correspondence back and forth. And they were just crazy things. And it was funny because people are always trying to make a sale. So no matter how weird my question was, they were just wanting to get a sale. So they'd respond. Like there was someone selling a hornet's nest, which is a really a beautiful piece of nature,
Sure.
So I told him that I wanted to use the hornet's nest. I said I have a nephew, and we love doing wacky children's parties, and I want to make sure that there's no live hornets in it because I'd like to put candy in and make a piñata. And he assured me that there were no live hornets in it, and that it would make he's like, I hadn't thought of that, but it would make a great piñata. I'm like, no hornets. Like, this is crazy. So it's just filled with all these kind of weird, odd things. Someone's toenail, photos from a colonoscopy, all kinds of strange things. Just one of my favorites is a garden gnome that was designed like John F. Kennedy from the 60s. So it's a little Kennedy face on the garden gnome, dressed. Again, just weird stuff, a goat toenail bracelet. I didn't know that you could make a bracelet from goat toenails, but
who did? Well, somebody did.
To this day. So that just kind of kept rolling.
So you finished this book, and how do you make the jump to the subject of your next book?
So kind of like you said, like I was like, okay, well now what, and so I talked to my editor, and I had been doing backwash, like I said beforehand. And so I had this sort of network of connections with the sideshow community. And for me, like the sideshow books that were available at that time, this book came out in 2005, American Sideshow. And for the most part, sideshow books were written by professors, and they were written with sociological point of view. And here's what's wrong with sideshows in our society, and a lot of heavy text, and a few images, which were nice. But to me, it was like, I don't want a textbook. Like, I want a book with lots of photos of these amazing people, and I want to know about the lives they led, because to me, they lived remarkable lives. To me, they triumphed over really difficult obstacles and things that were thrown at them. When you're born different, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s, it's not like you had a lot of opportunities.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was amazing how they could overcome those, and they could earn money, and they could find love, they could have families, they could travel the world, things they could not have done otherwise. And yes, there was some exploitation. I know that's always a concern, and there was some of that, but a lot of them loved it. They had camaraderie. They were with others like them. They were making money they couldn't have made. People were going to stare at them anyway. They were like, well, I should get paid for that,
Yes.
So to me, they were like amazing stories to share. And so I talked about this idea with the editor, and he liked it. And so I started working on that. He ended up not selling it through, but he urged me to continue pursuing it with finding an agent. And I did find an agent, and she's been working with me ever since. She's amazing. So I found Katie, and she got me a deal, which was amazing. And, here we are.
Mark, it's one thing to research, to look into, to investigate in an archival or a library sense. It's another thing to make that first contact with a real live human being who is the epitome of what you've been researching. Who was that first person for you that you were able to make real contact with, who had been living the kind of life that we're talking about here?
Well, in the world of sideshow.
Yes.
So there's a few. So first of all, there's sideshow has your working acts. You got your showman, and then you have your natural born freaks. So that's your armless person, your conjoined twins, and so on. Most of the people I was talking to at that time were the working acts or the showman. Not too many of the born freaks from the early era still around, and not too many that were performing at that time. There's a few more now. So people start performing after my book came out that I later met. But I spoke to a couple bearded women, which was amazing. And like, I remember meeting one of them in Brooklyn, Jennifer Miller, and like any of these people, I'll give you other stories too. But as soon as you start talking to these people, they're just people. You forget that she's got a beard. You don't even think about it. Like, you're just talking to another person. I had the same feeling. I wrote an article for AOL Weird News about an event that Dan Meyer, the sword swallower, who I co-wrote the sword swallowing book with, This was back in, I think, 2010 or 2011. He was holding the event, and he had an armless man, Jim Goldman, and a legless man, Danny Frazier, at the event, and they did amazing performances. Really extraordinary. And we all, I met them, and same kind of feeling. I remember going out to dinner with them all afterward, and I'm sitting across from Jim with the armless man, and he goes barefoot everywhere. And this was February in Indiana, by the way. And, he eats with his feet, obviously, right? That's how he eats. And you don't even think about it. It's just, he's just Jim, and that's how he eats, and it doesn't even faze you. So I think it's pretty amazing how quickly those things that make us different just go away once you make contact and have communication with that person. And we're all just people. Showman wise, there were a few amazing people. So, or actually, I'll mention another guy, Melvin Burkhart, who was an old time performer. I met, as I mentioned, Johnny Fox. Obviously, he was currently a performer, probably in his 40s when I met him. And then Melvin Burkhart, he was the guy that kind of inspired generations of sideshow performers. He was born in, I forgot, teens, 19s, somewhere around there. He was 94 when I interviewed him in 2001.
Wow.
And he's the guy who perfected or popularized the act of the human blockhead, which is where you pound a nail into your nose. And everyone kind of would borrow from his routine. And he did like a massive nail. He was a boxer in the 1920s and was a bad boxer and broke a lot of bones, and saw doctors going in there. And he's like, I could go in there. So he would do this amazing act, and he did all kinds of sideshow acts. He did like everything. He could be a one-man show. But Liz and I went down to Florida to meet with him. And the guy put on the show for us for 2 hours, which was extraordinary. Magic, sleight of hand with 94-year-old hands. It like blows my mind to this day. Did the blockhead, it was such a wonderful experience. And he was so full of energy and joy. And sadly, he passed away 2 months after that, which was a bit shocking. He's 94, so not totally shocking, but still, he seemed to be in great shape when we had met him. But I was thankful to have that experience.
You bring up a question here for me. A lot of folks may be listening and watching and thinking, okay, what's the trick? Obviously nobody ever really pounds a nail into their head, except that they do. There is no trick. You do it.
Right.
But what's the physicality? How did he go about that without, having the same results that I might have if I pounded a nail into my nose?
Oh, you can do it. I did it. Actually, most people probably did it, and they might not even realize it when they had early COVID tests. I think the early ones were working kind of the same way. But what I was taught how to do it by a performer named Harley Newman, who goes by the name of the Professional Lunatic, who does all kinds of amazing performances as well. And his simple instructions for me were, he gave me a plastic cocktail sword, those kind, and lubricate a little bit. And we all have a hole in the back of our nostrils right here. I didn't even know this, but there's like literally a hole right here that goes right straight back. So when we're saying into your nose, we're not talking this way. We're talking this way. And there's a cavity in your head. So there's nothing back here. Of course, if you were to like angle it up, you might hit your brain. So you have to be careful what you're doing. But he basically directed me, just do it, push it straight back. Your eyes are going to tear up. They did. Just automatically, not because I was, hurt. Just a reflex. And so you can do it. And I took part in a massive, mass blockhead event at a sideshow gathering, where he had taught me how to do this. That was also around, 2010-ish, also somewhere around there. But it's pretty amazing. So he could just do a larger one because he had a bit more space back there, and I think you can work up to it. People use drill bits now and put a drill in their nose. It's kind of understand your anatomy, and it's things you don't think about. But we're all the connections that go on inside your head that you don't realize are really there, but they are. You can go from your nose to your mouth. People put things in and kind of go back and forth, take a balloon. So most sideshow things people think are fake. They're real. They're really doing these things. It's not magic. Yeah.
You said something before that will always stay with me, which is essentially no matter how different another person may seem, from you if you have an opportunity to meet them, to sit down and talk with them and connect. That all the other stuff, it doesn't go away, but it assumes a place in the background.
Yeah.
And you're simply having a conversation with another person. What an important lesson for everybody in the world to take to heart. But so literal in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really truly interesting how just quickly, like, you don't see those things that make you different anymore. They're just not there anymore. You're just talking, and you know, ideally you're obviously you're joining that person's company. Otherwise, you know, I guess you'd leave. But had no experiences like that. Everyone was amazing. There was another showman I just want to mention briefly. His name is Ward Hall, who also had gotten his start when he was 15. I think he started in the late 40s, and he worked up till his dying day, which was just several maybe 6 years ago now, something around there, into his late 80s. But he was a showman who was just an extraordinary man who was running sideshows from his youth. Sideshow called the World of Wonders, which he was running with his partner Chris Christ, and he knew everybody. Like, he knew everyone. And we went down to meet him in Florida, and he just would tell us stories for hours, and we'd just sit there listening and soaking in as much as I possibly could. And but he worked with like everyone from that era, and so we had all these amazing stories to share with me, which was great because, like I said, most of those people were no longer around. So yeah, so it was. I had some good opportunities. There were a few other people I spoke with. I spoke with a tattooed woman, who was fully tattooed and worked that way. Lorette Fulkerson. She's also since passed on. There was another man who was, the world's heaviest man, performing with Ward Hall. He came up to Ward's house and we met with him as well. And he was a guy who was obviously very heavy, but was happy. He was content with himself. It was like, it's like my father was always on diets and it was miserable. And it's like, I didn't want to be that way. I liked eating. So I was going to do this. And he was comfortable in his own skin. That's the life he chose. So it was great. It was great to meet these people. I loved it. It was fascinating stories.
Am I correct in assuming that quite a number of people who have spent their life working in circuses and by extension sideshows, that Florida is a major location for residents and retirees in this industry, so to say? I'm wondering if that's the case, excuse me, if it goes back to the fact that the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus used to winter in Florida, and kind of set up a culture down there that sort of stuck. Is that your take?
Yeah, there's definitely a culture that was set there. So the main kind of town for sideshow performers was called Gibsonton, or Gibtown, more colloquially, and it's just south of Tampa. And you just kind of drive down the highway and you'll run right through it. So that's where we met with Melvin Burkhart, who I mentioned before, the blockhead, and with Ward Hall. He lived there. And when we were there, this was again early 2000s. There was still a good presence of it. There was a place called the Giants Camp. So Gibsonton was kind of started by a sideshow giant named Al Tomaney and his wife Jeannie, the half girl. So she was a half girl, no legs, and then the giant who was billed as 8'4". I actually met with their adopted daughter, which was awesome, and interviewed their grandson, who was a sword swallower and did other stunts. And so they're still, the Giants Camp has, like, he set up a fishing camp there, so you could still see the camps and the small little sheds, I guess, that you could rent out. And there was a giant booth there to market, and it had a restaurant, to kind of commemorate this. But it was also kind of being a little bit taken over by other industries at this point. There's still a place called the Showtown Bar and Grill, painted with all kinds of sideshow artwork and illusions, things like that. And the zoning laws there are very much accommodating to this lifestyle. So you see, like, the kinds of things you might see at a sideshow or a state fair, like the big vending carts and the signs and rides and things like that. These are all in people's backyards, basically. So it's pretty wild going through. You just see things you don't see in any other neighborhood in America, So that was very cool to be there. And then Sarasota has a population as well. That's where the Ringling Museum is. But Gibsonton was kind of the main sideshow, retiring, either wintering quarters or retiree retiring town for everybody. They had the community there. Lobster Boy was there. That's where that whole story went down. If people don't know the Lobster Boy story, it's pretty amazing.
What is that story? Can you share that with us?
Lobster Boy had the condition where you're, it's called ectodactyly, if I'm saying that right, if I remember correctly. But your fingers are kind of fused in a way that looks like you have like a lobster claw type of effect. But Lobster Boy was very abusive. He was in a bit of an alcoholic, so he was abusing his wife and children, and eventually Lobster Boy was killed. He was murdered. There's a whole crazy story about that. But he still has a son and a daughter who have the same condition. It's hereditary.
Oh my.
So they're still, I think his son still lives in the same area.
I guess if you are highly noticeably physically different, you can resolve to, live in the normal, what we'll laughingly call the normal world, and deal with people trying to deal with you, or find a sense of community with people that you share these things with. There's no right or wrong. I guess it's really what you're comfortable with. And
yeah.
I'm sure you to different degrees, the people that you met came to their own decisions in their own ways for their own reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now people, there's more opportunities, of course, and people are more accepting as well. So that's obviously good, and that's good progress. Like Jim Goldman, the armless man, when I met him, I remember he had his own, he was an entrepreneur. He had his own business. He just did this kind of like, I think he would do some shows on the side, but that wasn't his thing. He was a businessman, which was great. He could do whatever he wanted. Probably a little bit harder to do, in like 1880,
Wow. I guess. How old were you when you saw the film version of the extraordinary play, The Elephant Man?
Oh, probably 7 or 8. Yeah. Maybe a little young.
Well, yes and no. I saw it when it came out, so I was, an adult, but I had never heard of John Merrick. And I don't think there's ever been anything set into a dramatic format that does more to humanize a person who is inflicted by such an incredibly challenging physicality.
Yeah.
And John Hurd did such a brilliant job bringing that character to life. And do I remember that Anthony Hopkins was the doctor?
Yeah, by Frederick Treves. Yep.
What a powerhouse. I would like to think that, rather than freak a kid out, it's an early lesson in human compassion.
Yes. Yeah. It really is. It is. It's a very sad film, but at the same time, there is a bit of triumph to it because they do forge that relationship, and Treves does what he can to help him. And you see, like, Merrick just has this like soul where he's just like, he keeps like a positive outlook as best he can. He finds joy in all the little things, where he can, and he's thankful for all these things.
And how his attitude affects, the otherwise sort of wealthy dilettante people who, the same kind of people that in the 19th century would tour slum, with protection to see how the other half lives, either to feel superior or to feel more human, because they were folks who wanted to, change things in terms of progressive legislation, or a kind of curiosity that we have of actually having an opportunity to make contact with somebody completely outside of their reality. and perhaps in the process, again, to become a bit more human themselves, which is it's captured very well in the film. We're off on a tangent here, but if you haven't seen that film, we highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So at a certain point, you complete the book, it's published, you start to get responses to it, you've completed another project. How do you arrive at what comes next?
Well, what came next was very different. But it's like you said, like, okay, what am I going to do next? And I would keep like a list of ideas. So things pop into my head, I write it down, and I'd have like literally a thing that says like new book ideas. And, you write it down, and maybe a week later you look back, like, that was dumb, whatever. You see what kind of sticks and what feels like there's something to it.
Yeah.
So I had this thought pop into my head. You never know where ideas come from, which is a good thing. That's something that's always works in my business and advertising. You never know where it's going to come from. So you just expose yourself to things, and, you get this input. I think this idea kind of sparked from watching football. And this is going to sound weird. I love football. First of all, Denver Broncos fan my whole life. I can't stand at the end of games when they interview a winning player or whatever, and they thank God for the victory. It drives me crazy, because first of all, is God the biggest fair weather fan in the universe? Because if he loved the team, you'd be undefeated. You win a Super Bowl. Like, everyone, it's always different every year.
You will win. Yeah, you will lose. I have spoken.
Yeah. Sorry, your 3-game streak's over. I'm on. It's just like, doesn't make any sense to me. It drives me nuts. So I had this thought, like, why can't we just tell God to, like, keep it down, keep it to yourself, kind of thought. So I thought this was kind of funny, and I started finding a few stories. Like, okay, well, let me see what I can find here. There's the football examples. That's one, but I don't know how much of this, like, how many people are doing this. I don't really know. So I start using, I guess I was going through Google, and I would type things in like, God told me to, the Lord told me to, God told her to, God said to, all these sort of variations on that phrasing. And you just start finding all these crazy news articles, some of which are funny, some of which are scary. Just the things that people blame God for, basically. God told me to do this horrible thing or this wacky thing, and here's what happened. So I collected, I talked to my agent about this. She's like, this is great. This could be really fun. Let's collect like 50 of them to pitch to a publisher. So I did. I was amazed at how many I could find. I didn't know. It was a good kind of pressure tested. Like, wow, there's a lot of material here. So basically that book became God Told Me, or oh my God, I'm blanking because I had an original name for it. Hang on. I'll grab a copy. God Made Me Do It. I was screwing up. I was thinking of the phrases I just told you. So it's this book, God Made Me Do It. True stories of the worst advice the Lord has ever given his followers. And the book is just all kinds of quotes. Here's one. Is this one for the? Yeah. So like this one's from someone who talked about God on The Price is Right. So it gives a quote, and then it gives you like a quick summary of what the story was, the article. So like I said, it ranges from like the disturbing to just the kind of quirky and funny. Some of the most disturbing stuff I left out because it was too disturbing. But
I imagine that you had to approach this with the understanding that you don't want to offend people of faith, but that phrase, God told me, has a lot of latitude. It's
yes. And so as an example, I wouldn't include stories where I thought it was something that was positive to someone's faith. So for example, God told me to push on and work harder in my career, whatever, like things that bring good things. That's not what this book is, because that's an example of where faith and belief in God is positive, right? This is the crazy, wacky stuff where if God's telling you this, then God should have better things to do. God shouldn't be telling you to, like, eat your neighbor. God shouldn't be telling you to not pay your income tax. God shouldn't be telling you to build there's one here where he tells a guy to build life-size Jesus out of 35,000 toothpicks. The guy had a bum hand from an injury, and he has no art capabilities at all. But he spent 10 years building this life-size thing because God told him to. Like stuff like that. We got bigger problems on this planet, right? That if God's there, he should focus his attention on a little bit more.
Amen.
Yeah.
Did you get any responses from that book that you did not expect?
No, I didn't actually. I didn't know if anyone like involved in these stories might have an issue, but no, I think for the most part, those stories were so out there that they were their own quotes. I didn't make anything up, and it's just a summary of stories. They're all out there. So it's all accessible. It's just kind of collected here. I just sort of found it and wrote it up myself. But yeah, I didn't have no issues like that came. Fortunately, because I wasn't quite sure, to be honest. Yeah.
And once God rested and you rested, the book was done. Where do you go from God?
For a brief moment, I considered the devil made me do it, but that was going in the really dark places. So that didn't really go anywhere. That didn't have the quirky side, really. So then I wrote, the next book I wrote wasn't really much writing at all. It's called the Antisocial Network Journal. And this sort of stemmed, this one's a departure from kind of the theme of everything. Everything else has this theme of weird and bizarre, but this one doesn't really. This was more of my aggravation with social media. So this one came out in 2014. So this was like Facebook and Twitter were kind of dominating at that time. I don't think Instagram, I don't even know if that was out yet. Anyway, and it just, all of it just seems so crazy. The subtitle to that book is A Place for All the Thoughts, Ideas, and Plans You Don't Want to Share. Because I was just amazed at like all this, like everyone's just sharing everything. Like nothing's sacred, nothing's personal at all anymore. Like what's with us? So this was this idea of like, remember when you just wrote things down for you? Like you don't need everyone to solve. That's where the journal idea came from. And then I would write like kind of funny sort of headlines at the bottom of most pages, just sort of poking fun at this idea and then the different tropes of social media. So that was kind of a fun thing to put out, which obviously was a quick and easy thing to do. And fortunately, I was able to get a publisher called Knock Knock to do it. They made it look beautiful, even with not much to say inside, but it still has some design aesthetics and a lot of fun to it.
Did you touch upon or tackle a scam that many of us have great affection for, the Nigerian prince who wants to give you a very large amount of money and only needs a small amount of money, relatively speaking, to transfer that large amount of money into your life?
I think I did make a joke about the Nigerian prince, actually. Yeah. Because I was like just poking fun at all the different tropes.
I ask in part because some years ago, I was shown a book that was, I think it was privately printed in England, and the entire narrative was a guy gets, a message that, he's going to have $5 million because he's the nearest relative. And he writes back with great joy and excitement and just looking forward to his new life. And the Nigerian prince has to keep reminding him that he needs his banking number and all that stuff. And he keeps forgetting to do it. And he just engages this guy in this conversation about, tell me about your background as a Nigerian prince. And it goes on and on for months. Basically, he starts to string the scammer along to such a degree, because the scammer isn't sure whether this guy is all there and whether it's just a matter of pushing him over the edge. And finally, after like 100 pages, the scammer essentially says, "You're not going to be sending me that money, are you?" He says, "No." End of story. It was
That's awesome.
It was very entertaining. You finished this book. Again, it is kind of a break from your normal paranormal, as opposed to just the quirky nature of digital communication and the like. The next book that you conceive of, and how did that come to you? In fact, I'm going to ask you to hold that because we're coming into our last minute here before we go to break.
Okay.
This hour has flown by at record time, as I thought it might, always having you as an engaging person that you are. We'll cover this again at the end, but where online can people go to follow you, to see what you're doing, to make contact?
So you can see my books at markhartzmanbooks.com, and you see my name there with a C. So just markhartzmanbooks.com. I'm on Instagram, just at Marc Hartzman. I haven't really been on X lately, but I'm there as at Marc Hartzman. I barely check anything there anymore. Yeah, and my email contacts on the website. So I'm pretty easy to track down.
Beautiful. Marc Hartzman and Peter Robbins here. Meanwhile, here on Earth, we are breaking for 4 minutes to take a nap, eat a sandwich, and watch a movie. Join us at the top of the hour again.
The UnX Network presents a health and wellness spiritually based brand of hemp-derived CBD products made by Hopewell Farm in Harrogate, Tennessee. We apply our Cathara energy work with all of our plants and products. Our products made in small batches with only 2 ingredients of pure hemp, full-spectrum crude oil, and coconut-derived MCT oil. Third-party lab tested for potency and legal THC levels with 6 strengths of 1 ounce oil to choose from. Know what you're buying and get what you pay for from Hopewell Farm. Applied directly to a specific area, Hopewell Farm topical salve in 1 ounce and ½ ounce sizes made with pure hemp crude oil, comfrey extract, and all natural ingredients. Find the Hopewell Farm link and coupon code on the UnX Network website at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com.
Unlock the mysteries of the spirit realm with the new book, Meeting Wallace. In this channeled work by renowned psychic medium Larry Costa, the reader will delve into the profound wisdom of his spirit guide, Wallace. Together, they share the transformative journey of harnessing psychic powers from the celestial plane. Discover the extraordinary psychic gifts that have empowered Larry on his path and immerse yourself in a thought-provoking and awe-inspiring read. Meeting Wallace is a groundbreaking endeavor, and it is a perspective seen through the eyes of a spirit guide. Discover the wisdom of the spirit realm alongside actual photographs of ghosts and spirit guides. Get the book Meeting Wallace by Larry Costa at Amazon.com. This is Margie Kay, and I'd like to say thank you to all of our KUNX show hosts, staff, listeners, and viewers for making us #1 on Paranormal Talk Radio.
While most near-death experiencers return to this plane of existence with alluring tales of their time spent in the presence of the divine, what happens when one crosses the veil into the afterlife, into the void? In the new book, Dying to Meet Them, Mindy Toutfest describes her journey to the afterlife after a devastating aneurysm, how a strange turn of events would lead her to spiritual growth, divine healing, UFO experiences, and a greater understanding of the universe. Get your copy of Dying to Meet Them today at Amazon.com or visit unxmedia.com for more information on this book and more amazing selections from UnX Media Publishing at unxmedia.com.
And we are back. Peter Robbins here. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth, and my special guest tonight is author extraordinaire Marc Hartzman. Welcome back, Marc. Live radio, you can't beat it. I wanted to pick up where we left off with your next book after.
So, okay. So as I mentioned, this one gets back into the weird. So I said earlier, like, you never know where ideas come from. And a lot of times, like, I read a lot when I'm not writing. And a lot of times when I read, I like reading a lot of nonfiction. And you just learn about these other interesting characters or events in history that sparks ideas sometimes. So I was reading a book by Colin Dickey called Cranioclepty. And this was a history of phrenology. Basically the history of phrenology. And phrenology is sort of a quack science where they were studying the shape of your skull. They would point out, they would map it, and like, all the different ridges and bumps would tell your
They could tell if you were going to a career criminal, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. And so criminals were kind of where it started, because those were the kinds of skulls you could get access to. You could get access to an executed criminal's head, right? So this book describes how Joseph Haydn had a friend who was a young aspiring phrenologist, and Haydn was, a musical genius. And so the younger friend recognized when Haydn was very old, he would die soon. And that if he could get access to Haydn's skull, he could slay the head of a genius and then compare and contrast the criminals, right? Like, what makes Haydn so different? Very exciting moment for him. So Haydn dies and he's buried. And there was I'm forgetting some of the historical details, but there was a war going on in Austria at the time. So Haydn wasn't given a kind of proper burial. He would have been given as a hero of this country, right? So this young phrenologist pays off the gravedigger, and he goes in and he literally saws off the head, takes the head out, and goes home and boils off it's horrific. Boils off all the flesh. He gets the skull, and eventually it's found that the head is missing. It gets traced back to him, but he gives the skull to his wife to hide under the sheets in bed with her, because when the police come to investigate, there's no way that they would possibly make a woman show herself and ask her to remove the sheets. So she's able to conceal.
You got a skull in there, lady?
Yeah, exactly. It's too improper to ask her to remove the sheets. So the head lives on. And anyway, the head ends up traveling around until it's for 145 years, until the head is reunited with its body and given a proper funeral at that time.
Nice.
Or better resting place, right? So I thought wow, that's just a crazy story. And so I knew of a few other body parts that had these posthumous adventures, like Galileo's finger. So I start making a list. I'm thinking this would be fun to write a book about posthumous adventures of body parts. So I'm making a list, and I come across the story of Oliver Cromwell's embalmed head. And Cromwell was someone I knew. Yes, thank you. And so here's what came out of this. I knew Cromwell from high school European history, but I dig into his story. And there we go. I love this cover. This was drawn by
I love the cover, and I love this book beginning to end.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
This was illustrated by a guy named V. Long, who's a brilliant illustrator.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah. So I start realizing okay, Cromwell's head travels for 300 years, more than twice of Haydn's. I'm like, oh my goodness. So it just popped into my head, I should write the memoirs of this head and follow it through its history. And so I scrapped the rest of the idea. I'm like, forget this. I want to write this memoir. I was just in my head. I couldn't get rid of it. I'm like, I have to write this.
Stop
book
for a moment, because we are talking for me about a sacred moment of extreme creativity. I don't know how else to describe it. You arrived at this idea the way that you've just described, but then you do something that I thought would be not just a challenge for any writer, but particularly for somebody who is not English and steeped in the history of England. You managed to, make the head come alive, and it's couched in enough real history of what happened to Oliver Cromwell, beginning with his execution, his beheading, the head on a pike, the head rots, the skin goes off, and sooner or later somebody ends up with that skull. And Cromwell's merry adventures for the next 300 years begin. I've had several English friends who have read the book now, and they also feel this would be difficult enough for a great writer and historian of English history to carry off, but for an American, nothing personal, but damn, it's such a great mixture of genuine history, of the brutality of history, of physiological artifacts, which fascinate us going back to the dawn of time, and this incredibly moving and engaging story, which is an opportunity for our protagonist, Oliver Cromwell's head, to observe, when possible, the passage of history. I didn't want it to end, quite frankly. That feeling that you sometimes get with a book that you really are enjoying, where you don't even realize that as you're coming in toward the latter part of the book, you're reading it more slowly, so it will last. An ultimate compliment to an author, and you've earned it. I cannot recommend this book highly enough for anybody as loopy as I am, or just who wants to see taking on a creative challenge and making it work in a way that it's hard to imagine. And every possible feeling comes up as you go through this, because it's based very strongly on fact. You really lined up all of the real people who had possession of and who promoted or hid the head, and again, giving it consciousness and its own sense of history and destiny. And I won't give away the ending. That would be very inappropriate. But how did you commence it? I mean, how did you make that jump from the idea, you'll excuse the obvious, to getting into Cromwell's head and making this a reality?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for all those wonderful words. It really is great to
you
hear
earned
that
it, man.
a lot. So thank you. It's always great to hear things come across the way you want them to. I think, a few things. One is I was reading a lot of early English literature and also not English, but a lot of Victor Hugo as well. So kind of early European. So I was kind of getting a bit of a voice in my head to some degree for at least the time period. And yeah, I did kind of map out the string of different owners and possessors of this head. The latter half of that 300 years was through 5 generations of one family. So kind of passed down. Of course, there's not a ton of detail and all that. There's certainly some moments, and they're all touched on in the book. But for the others, I kind of started to fill things in a little bit with some imagined anecdotes along the way. I do have a Meet the Elephant Man. I have a Meet Joseph Haydn at a phrenologist's office, because Cromwell was studied by a phrenologist. So I quote a lot of the real things, and I kind of interject with their own conversations between the two heads. But it was also just it was a vehicle for me to also explore things I love that are odd through history. So he gives his lens on it, and this world leader who can view things as a mindset but can't impact them because he's just a head. But also I always had these thoughts about death when I was a kid. Like, what happens when you're buried? What if that's wrong? What if our soul is trapped underground and we spend eternity thinking like, oh my God, what did we do here? These things have still bothered me. So for Cromwell, he was freed. Like, he talks about how freeing it is that he was taken from his grave and hanged, and he can now see the world and experience it. And shouldn't we all experience the world still in our afterlife in this way? So I kind of play with that idea, sprinkled through the book. But also I went to Cambridge. So he attended Sydney Sussex College at Cambridge for a year. So they have archives there, and I got in contact with the archivist, and he let me go through all the files. There's a few images I have in the book. I mean, here you can see. This is from 1799. This is a listing for a show that someone was putting the head on exhibit. and there was controversy about other heads that people were claiming to be Cromwell's head. I get into all those stories, but it was helpful to go there and just kind of like retrace places where he was at. Like, this is literally where, oh, there's the real head. That's the real thing from the 1930s. That photo was taken. You can still see the spike coming out from the iron tip of the stake that was put atop Westminster Hall. We went to Westminster Hall. I mean, I really was like, it's interesting when you go to London, when you know this story and you go to London, like Cromwell is all over London. Cromwell and Charles I. I mean, it's everywhere. You're looking, the galleries, everything. It's just that a huge part of their history.
Yeah.
And there were so many big events going on. The 1665, you got the plague, and you got the Great Fire of London. So he's witnessing these things from still atop Westminster Hall at that point. So I'm commenting on these historical events. And I was trying to be really careful about language too. Like, I was using a dictionary to check, like, did this word exist in the time I'm at? And if the origin was later, I would find different language. That
fascinated me.
Used at the time. So
that fascinated me. And your nuance and using enough Middle English to authenticate the voice in the story, but not to overplay it or get pedantic about it.
Yeah.
It's partly the joy of the English language, and as a writer using it creatively. But you ventured into territory again that very few Americans would dare to, and somehow you carried it off really extraordinarily well.
Thank you.
They're just vignettes I'm thinking about, and giving you an opportunity to again get into Cromwell's head, and we see his life after his life, that he continues to learn, to observe, to make conclusions based on, there's a point where he's been sequestered for quite a long time, and the next thing, he's outdoors and going through the streets and seeing how things have changed and taking it all in, and we're right there with him. And even if this seems absolutely outrageous, we don't want to let go. This is I'm on for the ride here. I want to see where this head goes and what this head learns and how things end up with this head.
Yeah. Now, I was trying to imagine, like, what's that like to see all these things? Like when radio came, I always wondered this, like when radio was first happened, or telephones, like, what was that like at that time? My God, a voice is coming through this box. That's amazing. It's still crazy that stuff works. And obviously what we're doing right now is insane,
It's true. It's true.
So I like kind of looking at it with those fresh perspectives. What things were like at that time.
You sure did.
A vehicle for that.
I want to go on to chasing ghosts because, people sometimes assume that if you are quote unquote into the paranormal, or in my case, you're associated with a particular subject, UFOs, that it absolutely is going to give you license, or you're the kind of person that's curious about everything that's strange and unusual, which is not necessarily the case. My interest in the phenomena of ghosts, something even as a child, I thought, this is fictional. But at a certain point, somebody has an experience, and it's so, how can I say, it's so self-contained and has its own set of proofs that you have to pay attention to it. Of course, one of my mantras is every once in a while somebody wins $100 million lottery. Every once in a while somebody wins. Coincidences happen, and some of them are extreme. We give them, purpose, associations, reasons. But every once in a while one goes beyond that. And it's like, whoa, this is beyond numbers. I have to admit that there's something to this. And very briefly for me, it was a good friend of mine. Their mother died very suddenly. And shortly after the funeral, they receive a call from their best friend who was not able to attend the funeral. And I mean shortly after, either that later that day or the next day. And the woman whose mother died is living in New York City, the other woman in the Midwest. And the Midwesterner calls her in absolutely a state. And my friend has to calm her down. And she says, your mother was just here. My friend is a pragmatist and a very logical thinker, and immediately starts to ask the kind of questions to pursue this. While the friend knew the mother well, she had no idea about the logistics of the funeral or anything. And what she described was coming into her home, and there's a landing, one story up with a balustrade, and there is her best friend's mother standing there, looking a certain way. And of course, she is shocked. The apparition is translucent and tells her to tell her daughter that she's fine, that she loves her, that all is good, and like that. My friend immediately says, what was she wearing? The friend describes it. What was her hair like? The woman wore her hair in a certain way in life, but, morticians sometimes change things. And was there any other detail that you can remember? And she thought, and she's looking up, at a woman, on the next landing, but she sees a large brooch that she's wearing, and it's articulated enough that she can make out details. This is what my friend's mother was wearing when she was interred. This is the way her hair looked, which it never did before. And the brooch was a family heirloom that looked exactly like she described. At that point, not having had this kind of experience and knowing these two women, I really had to begin to reevaluate my whole take. Now, before you wrote Chasing Ghosts, had you ever had an experience or had somebody close to you, like I just described, have an experience that caught you upside the head like mine did me?
Not really. And I know that's not an exciting answer. And I know, especially after the UFO question earlier too.
Yeah.
Before I get into this a little bit though, I will say I did have an amazing experience for my upcoming book with Quirk Books, which we can get to later if you want.
Yeah.
Which has freaked me out. And it's kind of related to all these things. But I didn't really have like a particular ghost experience myself. I didn't really have someone's story like what you just described. But and this book was similar to my others. It was something I liked since I was a kid, fascinated by. And I was excited to dive into, especially because of the modern spiritualist movement, which I was really fascinated by and buying a lot of old books on and already researching. And I was so fascinated by that time in history when millions of people really believed we could talk to the dead through mediums. And so I loved all that. And that kind of branched out into the rest of this book. But as I was writing this book, I would tell friends, coworkers what I was working on, and they would share stories like what you just shared. And these were people I knew for years. Like one of them, I wrote some of these stories are in the book. One of them was a colleague of mine, another advertising writer I've known for 20 years. He never brought any of this stuff up with me. Never said anything like this. And I told him about the book. He's like, "Oh, I got some stories for you. Can I send you some stories?" I'm like, "Yeah." And his stories he sent a couple of them. And they're pretty amazing. One of them, he talks about when he was 11 years old and he was staying at his aunt's old farm cottage, like 17th century cottage in Connecticut. And he chose to sleep in a particular room, and he was having these scary visions of an old man in the closet, an angry old man in the closet. And he couldn't sleep, and he had to go somewhere else. And he's like, why would, of all things an 11-year-old kid would imagine, why would it be an angry old man in the closet? Like that? Not something an 11-year-old would think about, right? So he says that years and years later, he was speaking with his aunt again and telling her about that story. And she said, "Oh, I can't sleep in that room either." And she also said that she had visions of an angry old man in the closet, and someone else had been there and felt like sheets being tugged away. And so this goes on, and he's hearing these stories. And then the aunt, I guess, finds out from neighbors that the person who lived there prior to her was an old man who was not well liked and had died, I think, in a house. And this 11-year-old kid had no idea of any of that stuff. And so, like, where's that come from? How's that happen? How is that energy, transferring in some way? So, and there's other stories like that in the book too, where it's just really hard to figure out a logical explanation. And I mentioned this, I think, earlier, that the book gets into some ways that science could explain some things. That doesn't mean all things. It's just possibilities. And some of those things are infrasound, which is a 18.9 hertz wavelength that affects us in ways that we don't realize, but it causes fear, it causes anxiety, it makes your eyeball vibrate, which of course you don't feel. It's so subtle, but it does cause like shadowy figures in your periphery. And it's often occurs in cellars, narrow hallways, places that are kind of like haunted house tropes. So maybe that explains some things that causes people to experience these things.
Some things.
Yeah. Levels of carbon monoxide that obviously aren't fatal, but can cause these kinds of sensations as well. Electromagnetic fields can cause lots of these sensations. So these are things that might explain some things, but they explain nothing that I just described about my friend or what you described either. So it still keeps this real mystery alive, which to me I find really fascinating. So yes, maybe we can explain away some things, but there's sure a lot of stuff we can't. And it really makes you wonder.
In doing your research for this book, did you end up visiting the town of Lilydale, New York?
I did. Yeah.
Let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah, that was the place I was excited to go to. It was amazing to be there. It was the only thing that made it not as ideal as it could have been. Maybe it was better actually. But this book I started writing this in around June, July of 2020. And so that was COVID, like, serious COVID time. So typically every summer Lilydale has tons of events and people flock there. And
let me just jump in and ask you to tell people a little about the town of Lilydale and why Lilydale.
Yeah. So Lilydale is in Western New York, not too far from Buffalo. And it's a small community. There's literally like a gate you go through, and it's a spiritualist community. And I think there's one other one in Florida, but it's entirely spiritualist. It's been there since the late 1800s. And the spiritualism is a religion. And you go in there, there's a church of spiritualism there, and it's got like its tenets. And the basic thing is we don't die, that our souls live on, and we can communicate from the dead. And all these houses there, they all have a sign out front that says medium. So they're all like working mediums there, and they're all approved before they can operate there. There's a museum, which was unfortunately closed to the public, but I was able to speak with the curator of the museum, which was great. And they have what's called precipitated paintings. We stayed at this old hotel, and they were preserved in this hotel, which are paintings that came through spirits, through mediums. And they're beautiful paintings. And they were, supposedly the stories, they were painted through these spirits. So I was able to write about, those particular stories, the artists that created these, the mediums that created these. Which was, again, amazing to be there. It was, because it was empty, though, it was very peaceful. There were some working mediums, but it was, there's one of the images that is in the book, or I think a couple of images are there. But it's an amazing little place to be. And there's, we did sit, they have an outdoor area where there's a place called Inspiration Stump, which is an old tree stump tree was knocked down by lightning. And it's believed to have a lot of spiritual energy. So mediums come and they kind of speak to different people out in the audience and give quick readings, and it's a pretty extraordinary place to be. So it was good to be there. It's always good to travel and be in the places you're writing about, get a better understanding. You get to meet more people. All that kind of comes through in the book. But yeah, it was great to be there for sure.
Would you say that your investigation into the afterlife, so to say, in this case, doing the research for Chasing Ghosts, in any way changed your attitude, or basically you came out of it open-minded as you were going in, but not transformed by things that you had learned, or that things were a little bit different for you?
I would say I went in open-minded. And I certainly remain open-minded, and I describe all this in the book. I describe the thing I said to you at the beginning, that like I haven't had my personal experience, but I also kind of end it. It goes back a little bit to what I said about the Cromwell and my concern about death and what happens. And to me, it's like you really have two choices. You can believe that there's something, or you can believe that there's nothing. And without evidence, really, either way, I'd rather believe that there's something. I think it's a much more hopeful way to go. It's very bleak the other way. And to me, there's enough fascinating stories to think that, like, well, maybe there is something. And it goes back to, I go into some early cultural history around the world. And this is not by any means like a unique phenomena. Like, this is every culture throughout history has had these beliefs in the afterlife and death. And some of them are really fascinating how similar they are, even though there was no contact whatsoever between cultures. And there's lots of places in the world, like, Mexico, for example, they have right now it's Dia de los Muertos, so there's a lot of cultures where this belief is very common, and it's weird to them to think that we even question it, and so you do wonder, like, have we lost anything just through history, that we just think that we know everything now? Maybe we've lost some knowledge that was once a bit more common. To me, there's just a lot of really wonderful curiosity that remains in this topic. I love it.
Again, your interest in non-standard ways of making a living does go back to Robert Ripley. And this man, again, I think most people in America have at least heard his name. But there was a time not that long ago, starting in the 1920s, certainly into the 30s, 40s, 50s, where this man was an international presence, really a superstar whose work, so to say, transcended national borders. Can you tell us a little bit about how Robert Ripley, because fair enough to say he was a mentor, even if not directly, how he got his start, and why the tremendous popularity syndicated in hundreds of newspapers through the 30s and 40s.
Yeah. So Ripley, in the article you showed before, was a piece I wrote about him for Bizarre magazine. But that one, that's Betty Lou Williams is that image on the center left there, with a parasitic twin. So she's an American Sideshow, by the way. So Robert Ripley, he was like this young boy who had artistic talent and loved drawing and was looking for, like, what am I going to do? And he started pitching some drawings to local newspapers. And eventually he sold some work, gets hired as a cartoonist, and he ends up moving to New York. I think he was born in California, if I remember correctly. Some of these, I wrote that a long time ago, but he moves out to New York, and he's basically drawing sports cartoons. I think his first cartoon was called Champs and Chumps, if I remember correctly. And this was, again, details are a little rough in my head right now, but I think it was around 1918, 1919 when he was doing that. And so he would just write about, almost like Believe It or Not, of sports. Here's a crazy sports story. Obviously, that had like a nice readership for people who love sports and everything in the newspaper. And then at some point, he made this turn towards other bizarre things, and so he decided to call it Believe It or Not, and that just took off. All of a sudden, it's the same thing that made sideshows successful. Is human curiosity. It always sells. It's innate in all of us, right? And so he would just find these amazing things, and people would send in letters. He would get thousands of letters a week from people with their stories, and so some of those would get chosen. And then he became this like modern day Marco Polo, just traveling the world looking for oddities
all over the world.
Yeah, there was no one more traveled than Robert Ripley. That, think about travel at that time. I mean, it wasn't easy, right? It was investment in time and money. And he would just seek out these different cultures and people and find interesting things and draw them up. He drew his cartoons upside down, by the way, which is his kind of his own story. Yeah, he illustrated everything upside down.
That
just
is incredible.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting character. And this was a guy who made such an amazing living at drawing a cartoon for a newspaper, which, like, wow, I wish those days were still around. I mean, but at a time he just was able to capitalize on the medium and a nice niche that no one else was really tapping into, at least in the publication that way. And then then he took on media as it came around, like radio. He began doing Ripley's on the radio, and then television came around, and Ripley's went to television. And I mean, you can see those clips still, like Turner Classic Movies, TCM. They run lots of Ripley's, like usually like 10 or 15-minute little clips from his show. And I mean, he's not a great TV personality by any means, but there weren't many people around doing anything, and he had something to sell and something interesting for people to watch. And so
amazing.
He made this amazingly successful career. And obviously all the books came out and continue to this day.
Mark, with all of these fascinating subjects as targets of opportunity to write about, develop, share with other people, as boys, the idea of a sword swallower. I mean, there's something so basically, I don't know, fascinating, morbid curiosity. We know what a sword is. It's this ancient piece of metal used for guys to kill other guys. And how did you zone in on this subject? Was it through sword swallowers that you met? Because it's, to think about specializing in this subject for a book and working on the book with, well, a sword swallower.
Yes.
And to get Uri Geller to do the forward.
Yes.
And did you come up with that title? That's golden.
So Dan came to me. So Dan Meyer is a sword swallower you see there.
Yeah.
And he's a real renowned sword swallower. He's been doing this for around 25 years, maybe a little bit longer. And he's been researching sword swallowing that whole time. So he runs an organization called the Sword Swallowers Association International. It has a website. And he's been just kind of collecting information of these historical sword swallowers.
Wow.
So he approached me about, and I've known Dan for years. I mentioned I wrote about him with AOL Weird News, and we've done other projects together. He's a really, really great guy, very talented. And so he approached me about maybe 6 years ago or so with this idea. He said, "Hey, Mark, I want to do this book. I've been collecting all this information, and I have a title for it. It's called To the Hilt." The hilt being the end of where the handle goes. And he's like, "I'd love for you to help me write this. Are you interested?" And I was like, "Oh, actually sounds really kind of cool. It'd be fun." So we got to start on it. And then it just kind of got bogged down with the Big Book of Mars and Chasing Ghosts and We Are Not Alone. But I came up with a subtitle because I thought it was great to say a sword swallower's history of sword swallowing, because this was with Dan, who is a sword swallower. And I thought there's something fun about hearing about this art form from someone who's a practitioner and a historian at the same time. So we love the title. And so it kind of got on the back burner, as I was saying. And then I'll bring in Uri Geller. So this is kind of funny how things come together. I mentioned I have another book coming out with Quirk Books, where I had a crazy experience with remote viewing, which we can get to if we still have time. But as I was putting together my proposal for that book, I always kind of like to say, like, at this point, I've got these different networks and connections, which I know can be helpful in the next project, right? So I'm saying, hey, I have connections to this person who I think can help me with different aspects of this new book. And so Uri Geller was one of the people who the CIA worked with in the early 1970s at the Stanford Research Institute to study this idea of psychic powers and remote viewing, and just this idea of psychic spies. So I thought by now, between the people I know in the world of sideshow and like the paranormal and just I know magicians, like I just figured surely someone I know by now can connect me to Uri Geller, so I could, hear from him. So no joke, like a day after I wrote that in my proposal, and I kind of wrote it as like a funny bit, like, sure, I'm sure I know someone, I see a video on social media of Dan Meyer with Uri Geller pulling a sword out of his throat. I'm like, oh, Dan knows Uri. There we go.
I guess.
So I reached out to him and I was like, hey, this is what I'm doing. Do you actually know Uri Geller, or was this just like a quick publicity type of thing that you did? Because he travels the world and goes on TV shows everywhere. He does all the Got Talent shows. So he met Uri through Israel's Got Talent. And sure enough, he's like, yeah, we become friends. Like, I'm in touch with them. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. Can you put me in touch with him? And so after some back and forth and kind of explaining what I'm looking for and everything, he eventually did put me in touch with Uri Geller, which was amazing to talk to him. And, he shared some stories with me. But at that point, Dan said, hey, I'd really love to get this sword swallowing book going again. And so I kind of had a window when I was waiting for the green light from the publisher. So I was like, you know what, let's get it done. Let's dive into it. This will be fun. I still want to do it. And I just started writing every day about different sword swallowers, starting with his research, but adding my own research to it, and then writing everything up and trying to make each one sound interesting and unique. And that was one thing I found really exciting, was that even though this was all sword swallowers, they all have different amazing stories. They all have unique paths, why they started doing this, the things that happened to them. So each one does feel like a very different story. It's not like, and then this guy swallowed these swords, and then this person swallowed these swords. It doesn't have that, feeling of repetition. They're all just amazing human stories with different trials and tribulations that they go through. And then there's a lot of connectivity between them all, because it is the kind of thing that you have to be mentored in. You don't just, and I don't want anyone to pick up this book and think they can swallow a sword. In fact, we have a disclaimer, several disclaimers in the book, but people pass this on. This is something you learn from someone else. That swords get passed along. And so the book kind of covers a lot of that lineage. You can feel it, like this person learned from this person learned from that person. And it goes through all those stories. So we go through, I think, around 80 different historical sword swallowers. Wow. And then we get to a modern era. And I didn't want to just write up modern bios of performers currently performing, because there's so many. And I thought that might not be quite as interesting as all the historical ones. So we did a section, which I think is really fun, called Cutting Up Jackpots. And Cutting Up Jackpots is a sideshow lingo for swapping stories. And so we just had them share different stories of their sword swallowing careers, of like injuries or audience members doing weird things. People have had sword swallower, or people come up on stage, instead of pulling the sword out, they push in, which you can imagine, like, oh my God, no, that's not what I said to do. There's all kinds of crazy stories. It's a lot of fun. So it's great. And it's all kind of their words at that point. I just sort of transcribe what they said. So it's their stories told in their language, their words, and tons of imagery, which is a lot of fun. So I'm
so really looking forward to seeing this book.
That comes out next February.
Great. Get ready to return.
Pre-order. Yeah, I'll bring Dan with me.
Great. Some basic facts. Number one, how far back have the sword swallowers, and you as essentially a sword swallower historian at this point, when does this activity begin that we know of? Who started this?
So it's a tough question to answer with any real certainty. A lot of sword swallowers will say it goes back 4,000 years to India. There might be some truth to that, whether it's 4,000 or not. Don't really know for sure. But you kind of touched on it earlier with like swords being something that people would forge and then they would use it to kill each other, right? And that's kind of like, you kind of trace back the histories of metallurgy. When daggers were made, daggers kind of evolved into longer swords. But yeah, at that time, it's like, if you were able to get a sword, you were going to use it to defend yourself. You weren't like using it for entertainment. Like there wasn't time and resources for swords to be entertainment at that point. So you kind of move forward in time a little bit. And I know that I cited an instance in the book from at least around 1,000 or 2,000 years ago of an ancient Roman text that talks about a sword swallower, a performer who was swallowing a sword. So there's like kind of a pretty good degree of certainty, like, okay, well, we definitely have a written instance of it here in this ancient surviving Roman text, which is kind of cool to see.
Yeah.
And then it kind of travels up through Europe. It makes its way over the centuries. The Japanese were also doing it, and in China, as street performers, and India as well, as I kind of mentioned before.
Should we assume that, I mean, it's enough to think of putting a piece of metal that long down into your body through your mouth. Should we assume that the swords that sword swallowers work with, that the blade is dulled and it doesn't come to a very sharp point? Or are there instances of sword swallowers who actually work with swords that have very sharp edges and points at the end?
I think that generally they will dull the edges and dull the point a bit, because you don't want to have it go down, slice anything. It's dangerous enough as it is. So it's daring, but they don't want to, no one wants to kill themselves performing this, right? And people have died performing.
I don't want to use the word trick, but is the reality here that it's a matter of learning to hold everything at a certain angle so that when it goes in, it's going as straight as possible, that you've found a way to block your gag reflex? And I have trouble wrapping my head around it logistically. Again, I can guess that, putting finding that recess in, behind the nostril where you looks like you're pounding in a nail, but it's going into a place that's already hollow. Is that part of it? That you can't just go like that and, assume that everything will work out right. Not tricks of the trade. Well, maybe that is the phrase, but is there a basic modus operandi that all sword swallowers follow? I was about to say, to create this illusion. There's no illusion here. It's really happening, but to happen in a way that you don't physiologically damage yourself.
Right. And you're right to say it's not a trick. And they would say the word to use is stunt as opposed to trick. So the blockhead is something like you were talking about earlier. The cavity is there. You can do it. I mean, like I said, Harley Newman had me do it in no time at all. Sword swallowing is not like that. I will say it for anyone questioning it, it's absolutely real. There's no question it's real. There's no sword that's going into the handle. That's all nonsense. A lot of sword swallowers will swallow things with no handle just to prove the point to people who still are skeptical. But it takes a lot of training. You're right. You have to, there's the right angle. I'm not someone who does this, so I'm not speaking with authority on how this works. But yes, they are suppressing gag reflexes. There's multiple ones that as you go down the esophagus, it nudges the heart a little bit as it goes down. And so you have to work your way up to that. I know it took Dan, I think he would say thousands of attempts until he finally got one down. Some people do it quicker than others, but in some cases it could take years. Some people can do it in months. It varies on the person. But yeah, it's definitely something that takes a lot of commitment, and you have to be, committed to doing this and allowing your body to get adjusted to it. And I believe what happens is once you're able to do it, you get used to it, and then that just becomes something that you can just do. So but working your way up to it is not easy.
Also, I'm guessing, certainly in modern times, that you are working with a sword that that you have, become used to, if that's possible, but that it really has to be sanitized each time you use it. I mean, you've got the whole world of wonderful germs hanging out on metal. These maybe, seem like small things to some people, but you don't want to, the obvious damage your health with a sword is very literal, but those small things that are not so small is, that's really a rhetorical question. Have you and Dan been able to establish in some way what it is that not only draws certain people to wanting to do this, to wanting to do it as what you're best known for, possibly to make a living, and what is the lure of this extraordinary activity? Is there an assortment of things, reasons that people come to it, or I want to be a showman and this is the way I want to do it?
Maybe a little bit of all the above. Kind of varies, I think. I know for Dan, and if we come on together, he'll tell his story, and this is all in the book as well, but he was someone who was trying to do a lot of impossible things and overcome fear. He talks about being bullied a lot as he was a kid and finding ways to get past that and just do things he didn't think he could do. He just set out to do extraordinary things in his life, and he did a lot of them. But then he also became a juggler, and he was doing a juggling club in Nashville, Tennessee, and some sideshow performers came through, and he was meeting with them. And one of them was a guy named George the Giant, who's a friend of ours who swallows swords. If you saw that movie Big Fish by Tim Burton, George the Giant he's the smaller giant in the movie. He's the one that's at the circus, and then the other giant's like, the bigger giant comes in, but George is blowing fire there, and I forgot if he swallows a sword or not, but he's a great guy. So he told Dan, he's like, oh, if you want to swallow a sword, because Dan was asking, he's like, yeah, my recommendation is, don't do it. And Dan's like, well, now I have to do it. So he committed to learning it. Other performers will say, like, they'll go through all the different sideshow arts, but then sword swallowing is sort of the top of the mountain, like, well, if I'm doing all these, now I want to do this too. And I want to add to my performance by doing the most difficult and the most dangerous. Because not many people do it. Like, they're a very rare breed. There's not many sword swallowers living and throughout history. So it's becomes part of a very special club if you can perform that. And people are always amazed by it.
There are certain limitations based on the body that you inhabit that will govern certain aspects of sword swallowing. Let's say you are a very tall person. There is the potential to swallow a longer sword than a short person.
Yes.
Is there a record, or can you give us a number of inches that constitute like a record breaking, or how far do some people, are they able to insert it, and what the heck is happening on its way down that it's just missing everything that it could damage? Or I ask as just a complete goofball novice. The logistics of this are, and keep talking.
Not to go down too far, you might poke the stomach. You don't want to go down, overdo it. But George, if I remember correctly, because George was 7'3", I think he does hold the record for the longest sword swallowed. Which again, the number I believe is, I think it's 33 inches, maybe 31 inches, somewhere around.
Wow.
There. Yeah, so definitely, like you said, like he's got more room to work with. So I do believe that he holds the record for the longest sword swallowed. I mean, people, like I said, people get hurt. There's no question. People swallow neon tubes as well, and the reason for that is the effect that creates. When you swallow a neon tube, you turn the lights out, and that neon glows through the throat. You see it glow right in here in the sword swallowers when it's down there, and it's another proof point. Like, I'm not faking it. You can see it glowing through my body. So
that's almost scarier, because a sword is not going to break and splinter into a zillion pieces of glass.
Yeah, and that's happened.
Oh,
it's happened to people, and it's amazing that they've escaped with their lives. And I think it's caused. I think in one case where we wrote about it happened, and in years later, the difficulties from it eventually caught up with the sword swallower. But it's incredibly dangerous. It's a poisonous gas.
Now,
plus the glass, like you said.
For a lot of folks, listening to this, the sword is kind of an abstraction. They don't have one at home standing in the corner like I do. My sword was a gift to me from a friend who served in Iraq and bought it in a market on his downtime. It's a sword made in Sheffield, England in 1900 that ended up in Iraq. And Now that's longer than you probably want to swallow. Think I'm correct in saying.
Yeah, that looks pretty long there. Yeah.
But even if it was half the size, the hilt is very heavy. And in this case, it has been dulled, but there's still a bit of an edge. And again, the whole mystique of wanting to do this, to intrude in your body, because it's going to be, I don't know if entertainment is the word. It's going to stay with people. It's being involved in an activity that is memorable and has no other purpose than to entertain or to challenge our thinking.
Yeah.
You said that you have swallowed a sword at one point?
Oh, no. I don't want to. I am content to write about swallowing swords.
Good. I'm delighted to hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I'm happy to not swallow swords. I'm happy to be amazed by those who do and to share their stories.
I'm happy that you're happy doing that, because I want to keep you as a friend. Where can one go these days to see somebody swallow a sword?
Well, certainly Coney Island, if you're in New York. Coney Island still has a sideshow, and there's always sword swallowers who are swallowing swords there. There's World Sword Swallowing Day, which this year, or coming up, is February 22nd. And so in the past, Dan's always organized those at Ripley's museums, Ripley's auditoriums. Hopefully we can coordinate with them for this year. We're working on that now. There's other like traveling shows. There's performers that travel and will play like different nightclubs. And there's certainly sword swallowers in those different acts. So there's still people traveling doing this for sure. It's not a ton of people, but they're out there.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're coming into our last few minutes. Can you tell us a little bit about what is coming next from you as a writer researcher?
Yeah. So the next book comes out either late next year or early 26. It's called "You're Not Supposed to Know About This," and it's about a history of secret government projects.
Wow.
And so that one goes into all different aspects. So there's more about UFOs there, kind of a bit of a different lens on it from like a government's perspective of keeping these secret projects, and there are sort of reasons for doing maybe what they were doing. So it's a little different lens, but it gets into different cases than I got into necessarily in We're Not Alone, which was fun to do. But it just covers a really wide variety of different kinds of projects. A lot of it just stemming from the Cold War. So it gets into, mind control, for example, with MK Ultra program, which is kind of introduced LSD into American culture. Just a crazy story. There's a whole chapter on animals being used as, in some way to help defend us in one way or another.
The dolphins.
Dolphins, pigeons who were explored to steer missiles in World War II before that. There was a whole program on like basically kamikaze pigeons. They were trained to steer a missile before we had guided missiles. I mean, this is crazy. There was a whole plan to use bats to set Japan on fire. Millions of bats. This was not done, but this was a plan that was researched and money was put into it and the government was backing it. So it's covering all these kinds of odd, bizarre stories. They're all real things that happen. Assassination plots, all these kinds of things. And I mentioned remote viewing is another chapter. And so,
Mark, where can people find you? I know they can buy your books on Amazon, but they can also buy them directly from you on your website. And what is your website again?
It's markhartzmanbooks.com. Yeah, and there's links there to buy books. Like you said, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy books. Yeah.
My friend, it has been a pleasure once again to have you on. And we will keep in contact. I look forward to our next actual get-together. And before we leave the air, I just want to have a word with my listeners and viewers. Next month will be 4 years that I have been a broadcaster, and I'm very proud of what we've been able to do with Meanwhile Here on Earth. I like working for KUNX Digital Broadcasting very much, the people I work with, my fellow show hosts. But I am taking a month off. A situation has come up for me which will demand all of my attention for some time to come. The show will be back live on December 2nd, but please continue to tune in on Monday at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard. We are going to be rerunning some of our very best shows. And I will be back, but it is important for me to address the situation at hand. And I thank my friends at KUNX for their support in letting me take this leave. Stay well, fight for what you believe in, and don't forget to vote next week if you haven't already. Over and out for now.